The state has called 2 new witnesses to the stand in the Senzo Meyiwa murder trial today. Officer Keitumetse Mashele has testified about the swabs she took from accused number 1, Bongani Ntanzi, back in June of 2020. As we know, 5 men are on trial for the murder of the soccer star.
Ke introduce the person o kitleng go tsaya di buka mo go ene gore ke nna mang ke tle go thusa Sergeant Mogane go mo tsela di buccal sample.
I proceeded to assist him and I introduced myself to that suspect on who am I, and I will be taking buccal samples of that suspect.
Ka tswella ka mereko ka tsaya kit ele ka ba bontsha ni ile isa buliwa ka ba bontsha bone ke motsetse buccal ni le Sergeant Mogane le Sergeant Mabena le the person o kitlo ho motsa ntho ka ba bontsha kit hore ha ya buliwa e kitleng ho e berekisa by confirmer.
Then I took the kit and showed everyone that was in there. It was Sergeant Mogane, Sergeant Mabena, the suspect and myself, and I showed them that the kit was sealed and they saw it.
And who was this suspect?
Ne ba mphile lebitso la hore ke Mr. Ntanzi.
I was given the name Mr. Ntanzi.
All right, for more on the story now, we're joined by our reporter Mnisi, who, as we know by now, is tracking every inch of the story as it unfolds in court. Linda, 2 witnesses on the stand just today. The last time we spoke, we talked about, getting to the real meat of this case now after what has been relatively slow going. Shall we begin with Sergeant, or rather Officer Mashele, who talked about taking swabs from one of the accused?
Yeah, you'll remember that one of the things that were put to Sergeant Mogola was that she was present when the swabs of accused number 2 were taken, and she denied ever being present. And I think one of the assertions was that Sergeant Mogane rather, was not trained to take buccal swabs. So the state today bringing Officer Mashele, who took those swabs in Pretoria, speaking about how on the 16th of June 2020 she was on duty when she was approached by Sergeant Mogane to take the swab. She says Sergeant Mogane was in the presence of the late Sergeant Mabena, who was also part of this case.
Listen, it's difficult to keep track of all of the names, right? But these are the investigating officers that are essentially on the team. We know that it's led by Brigadier Gininda. But these are the other IOs working on the case.
Absolutely. These are the other IOs. You'll remember Sergeant Mabena was dealing particularly with issues around intelligence and information that would come into the case from an intelligence point of view. So they were there together, and she explains basically the process of taking swabs. She is qualified, or she was trained to be able to take those buccal swabs. She was introduced to Bongani Ntanzi. She introduced herself to him, and he consented to being taken these buccal swabs. These are the swabs that were used in the DNA analysis, which later excluded all the accused in the house at the time that Senzo Meyiwa was killed. You'll remember there was a big debate yesterday about these DNA tests, the regions, and what they mean. For example, that the expert told the court that these swabs or these DNA have 16 regions, and if an accused person reads in only in the case of accused number 3 in 7 of the 16, then you can't conclusively say that he was there. But
you can't conclusively exclude him either.
That's what Sergeant Mogola was saying, to say it does not mean that they were not there. So that was the argument yesterday about what exactly the DNA means. So she was then taking the court through the process of obtaining the buccal swabs that were then used for DNA analysis.
When we speak to some of our legal analysts on the program to also try and understand the various aspects of the case as it's unfolding, one of them just recently said, it depends on how you're watching the Senzo Meyiwa trial. Are you watching it from the vantage point only of court? Are you watching it from the vantage point of having watched the Netflix series on the murder of Senzo Meyiwa? And it brings me to my next question. The significance of these swabs being taken, excluding all of the accused from being in the house at the time of the murder, But then we know, according to some of the other coverage on the case, that the house was cleaned by neighbors who thought they were doing a good thing after the murder of Senzo Meyiwa.
Yeah, this is, if you remember, I think it was right at the beginning of the initial trial where we heard about, particular people. In fact, even in this trial, we heard that certain witnesses entered the house. There was movement of certain things, including the hats that were in the kitchen. Neighbors were entering the house and all of that.
It was a contaminated crime scene.
It would point to that, yes. It would point to that. So we don't know if for the judge this would mean that some of the missing parts are as a result of contamination, or is it because generally, if you look at the allegation that they stayed only during that period when there was a scuffle and there was asking of the phone, how much of their DNA would have lasted? I think the expert did touch on those issues because they took swabs on a couple of other places inside the house.
Okay, so who's on the stand now as you and I are talking?
All right, so at this very moment, we've taken a longer adjournment, a lunch adjournment, because we're waiting for the cross-examination of Sipho Ramosipili, who's representing accused number 2. He's stepped out of court to deal with some personal issues, but said he would return. So he still has to cross-examine Mashele. Officer Mashele's testimony has stood down, pending, of course, cross-examination by Sipho Ramosipili. But at the moment, Captain Martin Nailana, who had driven accused number 1 to do a pointings out, is on the stand. You remember he had come before during the trial, within a trial, to testify about how they got to the pointings out scenes and, the direction, essentially, that was given by accused number 2, allegedly, that he gave. You'll remember the state alleges that he voluntarily pointed out particular scenes. And
this was at the house?
This was at the house, amongst others. So what they're basically saying is that he directed them. So the defense now trying to rebut that evidence that he voluntarily took them to that location. So advocate, in fact, Tulani Mzugomezulu, who's representing accused number 1, says, questioning how they even got to Phosphorus, the routes that were used to get to Phosphorus, why they chose to use the off-ramp, the Barry Murray off-ramp, which take them into Phosphorus, when what seemingly was the instruction is that get into Phosphorus where there is a shopping complex. So he says that the witness is not forthcoming with information. So that's where he left his cross-examination. So at this very moment, we're now waiting for Sipho Ramosipili to come and cross-examine Sergeant Nailana, Captain Nailana.
Yeah, it is a bit difficult to keep track of all of the names, but we are really looking forward to when the lead investigator does take to the stand, right? Because a lot of the questions, especially during our officer, I'm forgetting a title now, but Mohola, who's been on the stand for the past 2 or 3 days, there was a lot of questions put to her where she decided to use no comment as an answer, saying that it wasn't her purview. It really is a question that should be put to the lead investigator. That's going to be essential to getting some of those answers.
Absolutely, Michelle. You'll remember he's right at the top of the food chain when it comes to the investigation of this case. So he knows every moving part or every part in this case. The investigating officers tell the court that they were commanded to perform certain duties, and in some instances, according to Mohola, they would not know about what is happening. For example, whether or not some other team members would have met the Meyiwa family, whether some people would have interviewed the occupants of the house. So he would be able to give the court an overview from a bird's eye view in terms of what exactly was done, why they were even pursuing the accused persons. In fact, why it is that we're in court. He will summarize the state's case in terms of why exactly we're in court and how we got to this point. Actually,
when you and I were talking about the case yesterday, we used the example of a newspaper editor, right?
Yeah.
He's the newspaper editor of this case. The reporters may not know exactly what the other reporters, their fellow reporters, are doing, but the editor has a bird's eye view
Yes,
of what will go into the paper. Linda Mnisi, as always, great talking to you. Thanks for coming into studio.